handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat, out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. My little contact over there at Heritage did such a great job last week. I brought her back this week because we need to talk about earmarks. So Romina Boccia has been kind enough to join us again because something happened really last week that didn't get a lot of play. And that is, I guess it was just Senator Ben Sasse on earmarks. So welcome, Romina, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, and I'm really glad to join you on a positive topic this time around.
Yes. Well, you know, we hear about earmarks all the time, but all of a sudden we kind of didn't hear about them. And do we fully understand, we little people outside the Beltway, do we really understand what earmarks are?
I think a lot of the American people have a pretty good idea what they are. They're basically congressionally directed spending where lawmakers in either the House or Senate come in and say, I want to use this many millions of dollars in the budget towards building a bridge to nowhere. That's one of the most famous examples. But earmarks have gone to a number of different projects. It's often transportation or infrastructure related, not always. Sometimes specific recipients will be picked for a particular government grant. And what was so damaging about this is that it basically put special interests above general taxpayer interests, because instead of using a competitive or merit-based process to determine where money would be best spent, lawmakers would come in and pick winners and then subsequently also losers who would get the money. And it often was driven by corruption, by who came into the member's office and dropped off nice gifts and who left the biggest campaign contributions, which is not the way we want to do policy in this town.
It almost sounds like, though, Romina, there's some kind of slush fund that we don't, it's discretionary, that's got to have some big money in it that these politicians could go, such and such wants, $2.5 million to restore a airport hangar that doesn't even have any air traffic. Is there some kind of a slush fund that we don't know about that these earmarked dollars come out of?
So there are such slush funds today. One in particular I find very egregious. And in fact, there's a bill right now being held up in the House of Representatives that the Senate already passed. It doesn't count as an earmark because it's a grant program, but it basically acts as a slush fund for these kinds of earmarks, except it's less transparent. It's the so-called Community Development Block Grant. And they put about $2.6 billion into that in this bill that's being held up in the House right now. Likely on Monday, when lawmakers come back into town and Nancy Pelosi will put it on the floor for a vote, it will likely pass. It already passed the Senate. There were only 8 senators who objected because they stuffed it in, of course, in a disaster assistance package. So they're only talking about wanting to help people and help rebuild the areas that were struck by hurricanes and wildfires and all sorts of other natural disasters. But what they're not talking about is that they're abusing these disasters and the American people's goodwill to want to help out when disaster strikes in order to put more money into this pork-filled slush fund called the Community Development Block Grant.
So we out here call them slush funds, but they have more formal names in when it comes to line items on money, correct?
Yes, but when it came to traditional earmarks, there wasn't a particular account or fund they came out of. The slush fund is really the American people in this case, and it's not even today's taxpayers because so much of the spending is now happening on the national credit card, and that will be borne. The costs from that borrowing today will be borne by younger and future generations who oftentimes had no say in the matter. They're not even eligible to vote yet if they're under 18 or they haven't even been born yet, but they will be saddled with the interest costs from this. But on the good news side, earmarks have been banned in Congress since 2011. Now, Congress, of course, always finds a way around those bans, but the earmark ban expired in the last Congress, and Senator Ben Sasse renewed the earmark ban in the Senate and made it so that it doesn't have an expiration date. So it's a permanent earmark ban. In order to get around it, in the Senate at least, lawmakers would have to pass a rule
Waivers.
change,
Yeah.
basically. So while we still have to keep an eye on them because they are going to try to find loopholes, and the Community Development Block Grant Slush Fund is one of those, at least we're unlikely to see the kind of egregious and growing earmark abuse that we saw just before 2011 when the first ban came into effect.
So essentially, the Republicans in the Senate side passed this in their conference, and that sends a shot across the bow to the Democrats in the House.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's one way to look at it. And the question is, are Democrats going to follow suit?
Now,
I think they should. I think all lawmakers should. And what we need them to do as well, and this is something that I commented on when I lauded the earmark ban, is that this is one important step in the right direction. But the bigger one is we need broader fiscal restraints such that lawmakers stop putting so much money on the national credit card. The deficit this year, we're looking at $1 trillion in deficits this year, and we're in a booming economy. We haven't had $1 trillion deficits except during the last economic crisis. That was the Great Recession. The Great Recession that was a calamity close to the Great Depression. And right now we're having deficits of the same magnitude, and they're growing. This is unsustainable.
We don't have a concept. I mean, I'm looking at monies being spent, other places across the globe, and applying some of those costs. It's really hard to get a concept of what $1 trillion truly is. Is that right, Romina?
Yes, but we can break it down. Say, for example, let's just take everyone in the United States today, every single person, man, woman, child, gender neutral, whatever people are these days. Take every person and you divide it by the deficit, just the deficit this year, the deficit, $1 trillion. It's almost $3,000 per person. $3,000 out of every person's pocket, including infants. And then if you look at our national debt, which is the accumulation of all the deficits from previous years, that's $67,000 right now. So you add the $3,000 deficit onto the debt, the $67,000, and that is that will be $70,000 in debt per person. It's a bit like, think of the deficit as perhaps your the monthly balance on your the monthly difference on your credit card bill, and then your total credit that you've taken out. It's basically the 1 year is the deficit, and then the debt is the whole accumulation of all of it. And yeah, $67,000 for the debt, and then add another $3,000 this year, and then keep adding to it unless we make policy reforms.
All right. So a big contributor then is certainly to these obscure earmarks. Are there other kind of gimmicks that lawmakers have been using to kind of slip things into bills at the very last minute? How does that happen? I mean, here comes 10 pages and we're going to put this in, and all of a sudden everybody votes, and we don't know that was in there. I mean, how does that really work?
So the way it works is that lawmakers are supposed to pass and debate 12 individual spending bills for all government agencies and departments. They're all separated into 12 bills. But instead of actually passing and debating those 12 bills, what they do is they wait until the last minute, and they take all of the bills and they put them in one big package, and that's usually called an omnibus. And that has all the 12 bills, and then now you've got over 2,000 pages. And then they release it maybe a day if you're lucky before they have to vote on it, or the government's going to shut down. And so nobody has time to read the bill. So that's very easy then to sneak things in because it's 2,000 pages. And nobody's going to be able to read it before they're asked to vote on it because they have barely even 24 hours. They're supposed to have 48 hours. I think even that isn't enough to have to read 2,000 pages. And I know this because when we put out our blueprint for balance, I had to read every single word, including the footnotes. And it took me 2 days, and that was 330 pages. Nobody can read 2,000 pages in 2 days, and that's how stuff gets slipped in.
So then we come down to really a stopwatch, and we have panic votes. And so, I mean, we don't have a representative government then, because, I mean, not only do we not know what's happening, but the lawmakers themselves don't know what's happening, right?
That's right. That is absolutely right. And that's one of the big problems we have, and they don't want to take responsibility. So this is convenient for lawmakers. They have the perfect excuse when there's stuff in there that they didn't want to support. Well, I didn't have time to read it. I didn't even know this was in there. How dare they? But this is, of course, all a trick. They could be debating the bills ahead of time. They could be passing smaller bills so that people actually have a chance to read them. But they intentionally bundle it all together and then try to push it through during the last minute so that people don't have a chance to read it and they can get all the bad stuff in it, which is why this is so damaging. I think we should demand more from our elected representatives. I think that the American people deserve better, but they need to demand it. That's what it comes down to. The politicians still work for the people. The people need to demand fiscal responsibility. And we should also praise lawmakers when they do the right thing. Like last week, for example, Nancy Pelosi sent everyone on a 10-day recess and then put the disaster bill, which has the slush fund money in it, on the floor for unanimous consent vote. Basically, no lawmaker would have had to go on the record and vote on it. It would have just been adopted by unanimous consent. And the only way to stop it is if at least one member raised an objection. And so the first member to do it was Representative Chip Roy. Then he went out of town. Representative Massey from Kentucky actually stayed in town so that he could raise an objection, and he did so on Tuesday, and they're going to bring it up again today and see if they can pass it by unanimous consent. So we'll see if somebody will stand up and block it again, and then lawmakers would actually have to come into town to do their job and to actually vote on the bill, which I think is an important part of the process, and the American people deserve to know how their lawmakers are voting on these bills.
It's almost nuts because the number of people like the Chips and so forth, they're fleeting. I mean, there's just not enough of them that are kind of standing guard on all of this. I mean, I don't see a lot of people that are coming out to the microphone saying we can't govern this way anymore. Is this just become, with the earmarks and these slush funds and these block grants and blah, 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 blah. I would say there's so many abuses in block grants. We may get into that one, but we don't know what they're doing, do we? We don't have a concept.
I think that's another of the big challenges we have is that the federal government has grown far beyond what's reasonable in terms of both scope and size. And so the oversight functions that lawmakers are supposed to exercise, and then the oversight functions that the people are supposed to exercise over their lawmakers, that whole chain that allows for a functioning democratic process is broken. And in part it's because the government is involved in too many things that nobody has oversight anymore. The federal government can't even tell you how many programs there are. They can't tell you how many government programs there are. They tried. They couldn't figure out how to count them. Or agencies will start different programs that Congress hasn't even authorized, and because they don't exercise oversight, they're able to get away with it. And I think we need to return to the founding vision, toward the constitutional roots of what limited government should be all about, so that our government will be focused our federal government will be focused on those national priorities that the people cannot handle on a state, local, private level in civil society. And the biggest function there really is national defense. And even there, the Heritage Index for Military Readiness shows that we've fallen behind. We've fallen behind. The government is too stretched over too many areas that it has trouble keeping up with its primary constitutional functions. And of course, things have gotten so complicated, it's almost impossible to keep track of what they're doing. And so they get away with it. But we must demand better. This is our country, and these are our elected representatives. And if the people demand it, things will change. Until they do, they won't change.
Retired Senator Tom Coburn and a couple others, I think Mark Kirk, were doing what was called a waste book. And then we have outside organizations that kind of do the same thing. And they publish these on an annual basis. But we're not attaching really names to it. We're just saying, we're paying for, shrimp treadmills and turtle tunnels. And Romina, I mean, why? I mean, this should be, congressional hearings on this kind of waste and attach these names to, I would say what's happening in those waste books was really these earmarks, right?
Yes, the earmarks were a big part of the waste books, but there's, of course, other ways that the federal government wastes money that isn't specifically earmarked, but that goes through competitive grant processes, and you still see waste there. Or depending on how you define it as well, you might say that things that the state and local governments should be doing, if they're done at the federal level, like for example, building a bike path somewhere, or building a rail car in a downtown somewhere, like we have here on H Street in Washington, D.C., that wasted an incredible amount of money, that is waste. There's still plenty of that. There are some efforts to put out these waste books, but what we need a more structural effort to really reduce those programs, and that's what we're trying to do in the Blueprint for Balance, is we identify those programs that are waste-prone, that aren't responsibilities of the federal government, and we say just cut them, eliminate them. It's the only way you're really going to get a hold of the problem is if you start reducing the scope and size of the federal government down to a more limited level that's appropriate for the federal government, so that lawmakers are focused on core constitutional priorities and not dabbling in all sorts of local and private economic matters, like the Community Development Block Grant Program, just like my favorite slush fund. Some of the grants, they go to a brewery expansion in New York. Now, I happen to love beer. I'm a big beer fan. But we have breweries all over the place. They're just fine raising money on their own. We don't need the federal government giving a grant to a brewery in one of our wealthiest states in New York in order to expand. That is just cronyism.
I almost don't even know what to say here. We have a law on the books, if I'm not mistaken, that every really government employee is supposed to report waste, fraud, and abuse. Is that right? Did I get that part right?
I don't know that how we would enforce that. I mean, it's against their own interests in many ways to do so, because the waste, fraud, and abuse that they recognize would probably be in programs that they're responsible for. So why would they blow the whistle on themselves? That doesn't even make sense. And so you can't enforce it.
And then what do? We put the burden on the Inspector General who's assigned to this kind of thing. And this Inspector General's work is really very narrowed. And, those Inspector General reports get sent back to Congress, and it's kind of like nobody cares, right?
That's the problem. The Inspector General reports are very helpful, but we actually need lawmakers and agencies to follow up on them. So the agencies are supposed to make the reforms and changes that respond to the threats and risks mentioned by the Inspector General. But then Congress also needs to enforce that. That means they have to exercise oversight over those agencies, make sure they're actually implementing the changes. And if they don't, they should impose penalties, including, for example, reducing their appropriations, reducing the money they get to spend until they fix the problem. That requires leadership from Congress. There are a few congressmen that are willing to do that, but not enough.
I have read a couple of Inspector General's reports, and I think that they're pretty good, but there's not a lot of teeth in them. They just kind of make recommendations, and then when they make the recommendations, they go over to Congress, on spending or waste or abuse or fraudulent stuff. And I don't see any proposed legislation really from any lawmaker coming out against those. So it's almost as though you've got standing earmarks in spite of what Ben Sasse led in the Senate, right?
So the earmark ban is important because we had a very egregious practice where that was basically the currency of Congress. In order to get bills passed, they would bribe lawmakers with earmarks, and they got very expensive over time. But yes, there are hidden earmarks. There are slush funds that work as earmarks, and there are a number of loopholes around the earmark ban if you know how to play the game correctly. And that's just always going to be the case, is that people will always try to find a way to get around the rules. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the rules. You should have the rules, and then you should also work to close the various loopholes that allow people to get around it. In some ways, you have to keep changing the rules because people, they work in the beginning and then people figure out a way around them, and then you've got to adjust them again. And it's a recurring process. I mean, this is a legislative body full of people, and they have incentives, and their primary incentive is to get reelected. And every day they see numerous interest groups come through their offices, whether they're in Washington or back in their home state, who are asking for spending, who are asking for regulatory favors, who make a good case for why those things are important for the nation. It's not like they come and say, this is only good for my business. They always make the case how this is good for the nation, and the lawmakers succumb to it. And putting a ban on earmarks at least puts another hurdle in place for them not to be able to dole out too many favors. And then we should take a look at the remaining slush funds, like the Community Development Block Grant Program,
and
really
eliminate
it.
That one.
Eliminate it once and for all. I really hate it because the abuse is just unbelievable. Just to give you an example, in the past 2 years, they bloated this by over $30 billion. It used to be $3 billion a year. It got a tenfold increase. Why is that? Because Congress is now abusing it as a circumvention around the earmark ban. Okay, we've got the earmark ban. What else can we use to continue to give out favors? And that's where we need the taxpayer to pay more attention and say, look, it's not right for you to tie disaster assistance, legitimate disaster assistance, to help victims who've been struck by major disasters to a slush fund that you're just using basically as a replacement for earmarks. Community development block grants should have no room in disaster bills, and they keep adding them because nobody is complaining about it, and they keep getting away with it, and the money they're putting in there is getting bigger and bigger, and soon the earmark ban won't even matter because we'll have so much money in those slush funds that it will just completely replace it. So I think the earmark ban is important, but we can't lose sight of all the other ways that they're using to continue to give out favors and spend money on pet projects.
And so I would think that some of this would come up before an ethics committee, but that doesn't seem to have any teeth either, does it?
Well, who wouldn't? You said who's watching the watchers, right?
I'm just wishful thinking radio host out here.
I know, you think, no, it's our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the people to demand accountability from their government. And this is an active process. Too many people think that their job is done after they've voted.
Yes.
That's just the beginning.
Well, you've done a remarkable job explaining all of this for us. I mean, it's out of control is using that word is almost not enough. Because there's not accountability, there's no discipline, and there's no consequence. And so we watch 22 trillion go to 23 trillion real fast, and we don't even have a concept of how bad that is because nobody talks about it. So we need to go back to that little debt clock down on the corner of the TV, right?
Yes, which, by the way, keeps going up.
Yes, it does. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please visit the Daily Signal, which is a daily publication of great stories that the Heritage Foundation puts out for us. They're doing remarkable work over there, as we've just witnessed with poor Romina. She hates that block grant community reinvestment thing. Thank you, Romina. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Oh, boy. We've just got excitement going on all over this country for all kinds of different reasons. If it's not immigration, it's the Russians. And if it's not Russians, it's Iran. If it's not Iran, it's North Korea. If it's not that, it's impeachment. So my buddy, my former CIA-er, weapons of mass destruction expert, Sam Faddis, has been kind enough to join us here on the Denise Simon Experience because there's a piece part to all of this that really hasn't been talked about, and that I'm using the word choreography. But with that, welcome, Mr. Sam Faddis, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
There are so many actors in this whole Mueller, Russia operation. I think that the names that we already have equal the deck chair off the Titanic, as I see it. I think there's probably multiply what we know by a factor of 3 or maybe more when all of these reports come out. Am I overstating it?
No, you are not overstating it at all. You were right on.
I have a feeling that we're going to be a little bit disappointed in the Horowitz Inspector General report. I don't, however, think that we're going to be disappointed in what AG Barr or the other special whatever he is, John Durham, is going to uncover. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think particularly the Attorney General has made clear that he wants to get to the bottom of this, which frankly I think anybody should want, right? Even if you think that there is no coup attempt, then you shouldn't be worried about people digging into this and getting to the bottom of it, and let's get some sunshine in because it'll show you're right. So everybody who's not trying to hide something ought to be all for, let's find out exactly what just happened.
I've been asked 1 million times, maybe a little less than 1 million, how many arrests are going to be and are people going to jail? And my answer always is the same. I don't believe anybody's going to go to jail. Do you?
Well, I think the not to make a pun, but the jury is still out on whether or not anybody should go to jail. But what I do believe is, I personally believe increasingly based on the evidence that what we just saw was a deliberate, choreographed, organized attempt to stage the first coup in American history. And if that is the case, then we either investigate this and put the people responsible behind bars, or you are establishing a precedent that will destroy this republic. And I'm not trying to be guilty of hyperbole. But if we now live in a world where you can try to overturn the results of a free and fair election and dethrone a sitting president and there will be no consequences, well, then the next time won't
Katie
be
bar the door.
The next time will be martial law. The next time will be Barack Obama won't step down. He'll just declare the results invalid while he's still there and announce he's not leaving the White House, or whoever is the next Barack Obama. That's the way republics die, and that's reality. So we need to get to the bottom of it. As you know, you were talking about numbers of people. Assuming that this is in fact a coup attempt, this was not something that, let's put it this way. I've been involved in overturning governments on behalf of the United States government and done that kind of work for many years. So that's not 8 people.
Right.
That's not a handful of folks and a couple of reports. That's a much broader, much bigger effort. So amongst the many questions to be answered is, who are all the rest of those people? And as I say to folks all the time, why do you assume this is over? Just because X number of people have been outed and are out of the government. Let's assume there were 36 other people involved in this at senior positions. How many of those guys and gals are still sitting behind desks in Washington, D.C.? And do you think that they just learned their lesson and they're done? Why would you assume that? I mean, in my mind, all that means is they went to ground. They did what trained intelligence personnel do. They go to ground, they wait. When you lose interest, they resurface, and then we move on to phase 2. That's all that means. That's standard procedure.
Let me ask a couple of things because you are a lawyer. And that is it illegal to run surveillance / spy on an opposition's political campaign?
Well, no, not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily on behalf of the U.S. government, assuming that you have jumped through all the correct hoops and have the legal authorization to do so.
Okay. The other thing, because you were CIA, it looks, given the, I guess, the country of residence of Christopher Steele being a Brit, Stefan Helper, I don't know what he is. I know that I think it was his father-in-law that was former CIA, Ray Klein. I think I got that right. And then we have this Mifsud character. It looks like both FBI and CIA outsourced the honeypots spying surveillance. Is that correct?
There are definitely indications of that. And there are certainly indications, again, that we need an investigation to find out for sure, indications that the Brits, including potentially British intelligence, are up to their eyeballs in this thing from a very, very early juncture.
I'm thinking that it's former British intelligence.
Could be.
Okay.
Could be. I mean, the line between former and current in any intelligence organization is very thin. That's two guys, one retired 6 months ago and one didn't retire yet, having a gin and tonic in a bar. That's where that line is. That's all that takes. All the time.
So I'm going to go back to a thing that we heard often when there's a new president about to be inaugurated, and that is the peaceful transfer of power. We really, when all is said and done, didn't have that. And I think we still have probably another 14 months. So that would give us 4 years of a chaotic transfer of power. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So having said that, it isn't a law that we have a peaceful transfer of power, is it?
Well, I mean, certainly that's what the Constitution says we're supposed to have. I mean, it lays out a pretty clear procedure. But look, I made reference to the idea of Barack Obama not leaving the White House. Okay, I don't know at this point that Barack Obama was involved with this coup attempt, so that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is, if we're at a point now where we can have folks who are trying to overturn the results of a free and fair election, depose a president, install the person they want, completely blow off the Constitution, then how far is the gap between that to the day when we actually have a sitting president who doesn't like the results of the election to replace him or her, and does say, well, all the same stuff they've said about Donald Trump, just don't step down. Just say, hey, the Russians threw this election. Donald Trump is an invalid candidate. He was elected in a corrupt election. I refused to vacate. I'm declaring martial law, and we will have elections when I have concluded an investigation and determined that we can have them, which is exactly what happens in about 50% of the countries on Earth with some regularity. That's exactly the verbiage used by every Tin Pot dictator and every banana republic and third world country around the planet. And I don't see any gap really between what these guys just did and that, other than I think these folks were caught a little off guard because they were so dismissive of Donald Trump that they ended up behind the curve and reacting to his election. Had they anticipated it, entirely possible they would have been making the case for, no, just nullify the election results, don't step down, and or hand the crown to Hillary. and now we are a third world republic, and that happens in the blink of an eye. I don't think that's science fiction. I don't think that's crazy. I don't think that's tinfoil stuff, tinfoil hat stuff. I think that's how close we are, because folks are willing to just ignore the Constitution and the rule of law.
In your former world of CIA, you kind of operated on clues, gut instinct, symptoms, operatives, and people telling you lies that you had to go figure out if it really was a lie. You had to do all these autopsies on things, on investigations. So you kind of live in a world of cloak and dagger, smoke and mirrors. But the FBI, I would say, does that same thing domestically. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah. As an aside, there's been all this verbiage in the press about how the FBI doesn't spy. That's 1,000% wrong.
False. Right.
By law, in fact, they are the only ones who can do domestic spying. They have a whole national intelligence division inside the FBI. So in addition to their law enforcement function, post 9/11, they have an express intelligence collection function internally. And if Comey really doesn't know that, well, then we can add incompetence to everything else that we can say about him.
I asked those questions to set up this next statement, because I need your help, and that is kind of going back to the moment where I said I don't think anybody's going to go to jail. Not that they shouldn't, but under the guise of this is the work we do when it comes to surveillance to prove something or to disprove something. So it kind of gives them plausible deniability to take whatever actions that they took, including John Brennan at CIA or Comey at FBI, such that they're going to gray out the definitions here that would give them a pass for any kind of prosecution. Is that a realm of possibility?
Yeah, without question. And it's interesting you bring up the concept of plausible deniability. I mean, this is another thing that intelligence professionals, this is a concept incorporated from the beginning of an operation. In other words, from the beginning of an operation, you don't say, hey, the op's going to go great. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Oh,
Right.
Whoops, we had a problem. And now we'll start trying to figure out for the first time what to do if it goes sideways. Not how that works if you know what you're doing. From the beginning, you plan for what happens when this goes bad. And one of the concepts with high-profile operations is the concept of plausible deniability. That is basically your cover story. This is the story we're going to tell, which will incorporate facts and provide a plausible alternative explanation other than we were doing exactly what the hell we were doing. You write that cover story before you start the op.
And I think that's playing out. That's playing out here, isn't it, in front of us?
Exactly what you are seeing now is we were all just doing our jobs, and we got this information, and we followed it, and I guess it turned out to be false, but nothing but pure motives. And every instinct I have says that is hogwash. And back to something I touched on earlier, the relative handful of individuals named so far, all of whom are out of the government conveniently, are not the full extent of this conspiracy. So I'd like to start by knowing the names of everybody that was. So, for instance, at the Central Intelligence Agency, and let me make clear, I am not impugning the CIA as an entity. At the CIA, we have clear evidence that Mr. Brennan is at the center of this whole thing. He's the head of the entire organization. Are we really supposed to believe that there's nobody else in the senior ranks of that organization that was involved in this, that was aware of this? Because there's two options there. If you weren't involved and you didn't know it was going on and you were a senior person, say the head of the clandestine service, then you should be fired for incompetence. If your boss was trying to overthrow the president of the United States and you really didn't know about it, how bad of a spy are you? And if you did know about it, then what were you doing? So, like, who was the head of the clandestine service while all this is going on? The actual operations wing of the agency. And if they weren't involved, then what did they know? When did they know it? And if they claim ignorance, then again, you should fire them on that basis. I'm sorry. Your president, your boss was deposing the president of the United States, and you apparently didn't pick up on that. So I don't think we need you as a spy anymore. I think you can go away. I mean, there's a lot, this is not 6 or 8 people who are now all conveniently out of the government. And we should start by figuring out who all those people are and where they are right now.
Now, both Brennan and Clapper have been regulars on CNN. And what bothers me is what I think there's an elephant in the room that CNN, and I would ask or say anybody else in media, is not revealing. Michael Cohen did his testimony and he's a known liar. But Brennan is too, because remember, during the Dianne Feinstein enhanced interrogation investigation, John Brennan spied on her entire investigative team and then lied about it and later had to come clean. So he has, that was a domestic operation, by the way, a domestic spying operation by CIA, probably pulling the triggers of a couple other agencies, mainly FBI, to help him spy on Dianne Feinstein. Right.
Well, I mean, look, Brennan's a completely partisan entity and devoid of credibility. So anybody who's paying attention to anything coming out of his mouth is wasting their time. I mean, I had a conversation with somebody earlier today and was asking a question related to what you just said. Where are the investigative journalists? When Richard Nixon had some guys break into an office, kind of a third-rate, low-level action against the Democratic Party, and then lied about it. The cream of American reporters were on this case and were not going to let go of it and ran it to ground. And God bless them. They should have. Where now we have the possibility, very real possibility, that we just saw the first attempted coup in American history, and that the head of the CIA and the head of the FBI were both involved. And yet I can't find a single investigative reporter in the country that seems interested in running that story to the ground. They all just want to accept it at face value that this was an innocent mistake or something and leave it alone. Are you kidding me? What could be more dangerous to the Republic than having those two entities decide to intervene in domestic politics? And once you establish that precedent, by the way, what makes you think that there's only Republican presidents they're going to act against? I mean, they can act against anybody because you've thrown the rule of law out. It's a terrifying prospect, and you would think every reporter worth his salt who claims to do investigative journalism would be just pounding the pavement to get to the bottom of this.
I think the only one we have is John Solomon over at the Hill.
Yeah, I mean, there are a handful, but very, very few.
I learned many years ago when I knew nothing, but I was watching the O.J. Simpson trial, of the obvious people and or questions that were either one, never asked, or two, the judge would not allow. And I think we're seeing some of that here because John Brennan had a deputy director and deputies over there at CIA. So I guess, where is Mike Morrell in all of this? Not a word, right?
Sure. Where's Gina Haspel, who is the current head of the Central Intelligence Agency and a Brennan protege? So where was she and what was she doing? And if the results are, and if the answers to those questions are completely innocent and everything she was doing was above board, God bless her. I'm not arguing for a lynch mob here. That's not what this is about. But there are questions to be asked. I mean, if you're sitting at the senior levels of that entity and your boss is busy trying to stage a coup, Where were you, and what did you know? And if you're telling me you weren't involved, how's that possible? These are all legitimate questions, and if the answers are above board, then great. But if they're not, then we should know that too.
There are a couple of international spy hubs where not only CIA necessarily hangs out with other foreign spies, either allied or otherwise, but FBI does too. And I would say that Malta is one of those locations. Is that overstating that location?
No, completely accurate.
Okay. But we have this weird place called Link University, which is actually a Malta university, but it's located in Rome. And it seems that CIA has had a lot of confabs or seminars or events there at Link University, as the FBI. So now we have Britain, now we have Italy, and now we have Australia. So we're kind of going back into outsourcing this operation, which says that the number of people and these pipelines were established long before the inauguration day of Donald Trump, correct?
Sure.
So we would only have to pull some of those strings and tap some of those people on the shoulders because of previous relationships. And we necessarily found that out with Fusion GPS. If you were to tell the listeners on a handful of people that you would kind of tilt your head over and want to do an additional dive on who they are, do you have any other names that we should be cognizant of?
No. I mean, I don't want to go into specific names, but I would say this: I think you brought up Professor Mifsud, right?
Yes.
So I don't know Professor Mifsud, and I've never run across Professor Mifsud. So what I'm telling you is not based on I know the guy personally. It's based on the fact that I know the business, and I know what I've read, and I know what I've seen. And what that tells me is you don't have to go do a deep dive on Professor Mifsud. In other words, the Central Intelligence Agency can tell you right now, today, exactly who he is.
Yes.
And exactly who he's working for.
Yes.
This is not a mystery. He's around all over the place. He's working for somebody, and he's clearly being tasked and directed by some entity, maybe by more than one, because sometimes guys like that float around and work for multiple entities. But he is not invisible, and they won't have to go launch an investigation. All you have to do is sit down with the right clearance, and they will say, this is who the hell this guy is. And that is probably true of all the other major players here, because they're all bouncing around all over the planet, and there are lots of different events. And I will guarantee you they are known quantities. These are not they may be secrets as far as the average citizen isn't concerned, but they are not secrets to American intelligence. So yet another, question. So then why don't we know? Why doesn't somebody with the proper clearance on the right side of things, why haven't they been briefed on all of this and told straight up, this is who this guy is, and this is why he was in wherever he was on a particular date, doing what he was, because the agency will know. These are not, anyway, it's not that hard, bottom line. It just ain't. It's very straightforward stuff, and it's being done all the time. And when Papadopoulos talks about being, meeting people and people talking to him, all I think is, yeah, you're being bumped by multiple people who've been sent to contact you and dangle information in front of you and see if you'll bite. Old technique, done it a million times to other people, had people try to do it to me. No secret. Maybe to the average citizen it is because they don't live in that weird world, but it's not. It's not unusual or mysterious to intelligence. It's obvious for exactly what it is. Now, who exactly was doing that and who was bumping people into you? Maybe that's what we got to figure out. But we can see right now what was being done to you. They were trying to play you. They were dangling bait in front of you to see if you'll bite.
And so when Trump gives declassification authority and provides that to AG Barr is going to go tap on the shoulders of NSA, DNI, FBI, and whatever other agencies they're out there. They're either going to, one, cough up what he wants, or two, they're going to throw some sand in the gears. And so we shouldn't expect a declassification of these documents anytime soon, correct?
Well, I mean, obviously the president has full declassification authority. He can declassify anything he wants, and he can just simply order that done, and it should happen automatically. By virtue of telling the AG that he's given him that authority, that ought to end the discussion. In the reality of what is happening in Washington, D.C. right now, you're entirely correct. I mean, because we are seeing, whether people understand this or not, we are seeing the bureaucracy. You can call it the bureaucracy, the swamp, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. We are seeing unelected senior bureaucrats in the federal government defying the president of the United States and actively working against him. And that is, I mean, look at Brennan and the fact that his security clearance was never pulled. How the heck is that possible? That should have happened before sundown on the day that the president said, make it happen. Now, that's, again, terrifying because nobody elected those people. No, they don't answer to anybody other than themselves. And when they start doing that, you've lost control of your government. You could hate Donald Trump for all I care. That ought to terrify you that you have bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.
They're defiant.
They don't have to listen to the president of the United States. Well, if that's true, then they don't listen to you or anybody else. They are now acting on their own. And they could just, I mean, you may be a Democrat and think, I hate Trump and I'm happy that they're defying. Well, you know what? In a few years, it could be a Democratic president in power, and they could be subverting everything he's attempting to do. I mean, this is not an answer. So anyway, who knows where we're going with the declassification? I think, obviously, the folks involved in this whole thing are terrified that they're not going to be able to hide behind that screen anymore. But again, Brennan still has a security clearance, which, by the way, is incredibly useful to him because what it means is he can sit down and talk to all of his cronies that are still. Yeah, absolutely. His cronies inside the government can pass him anything they want and basically be immune from prosecution because they claim that he still has access. So, ladies and gentlemen, everything.
A big, huge round of applause to Sam Faddis for clarification and context. Thank you, Mr. Sam. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us because there's more coming your way.
The truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Mike Charlie 4-3-5-9-2-1. Grid to Mark. Mike Charlie 4-7-3-9-8-9 out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds AGPT. Gas TOT 5 per unit. And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We don't have to talk about Russia anymore, but we should be talking about China. So So what do? Well, I call on our dear friend Gordon Chang, who is the expert on all things China, and he is also the author of The Coming Collapse of China. Because we are in a trade thing and all kinds of weird talks with China. And so Gordon's going to help us put things in context. So, Mr. Gordon, thanks for being on the Denise Simon Experience.
Oh, thank you so much, Denise.
Okay, well, the newest thing in all of these talks with China now is rare earth metals or rare earth minerals. And so it looks like China has actually put out some threats to the United States that kind of like, hey, you guys better be careful. We're warning you because we do buy a good bit of rare earth minerals from China, and they seem to have the majority shares of those minerals, correct?
Yes, we buy about 80% of our requirements of rare earths from China. And so they do have a leverage over us. But it's a lot less leverage than most people think, because for one thing, rare earth minerals aren't as rare as their name implies. And there are mineral sources in Japan, Malaysia, Russia, I think, Brazil. And also they're just new technologies where we can bypass some of the requirements for buying these rare earths. But, this is, and Denise, it's really important to mention one thing, and that is China actually restricted the export of rare earths to Japan in 2010 when they had a territorial dispute. It actually didn't work very well for China then. And in addition, it is a violation of their World Trade Organization obligations, which is what the WTO actually decided. So this shows that China is essentially does not feel bound by the rules of the global trading body. And we've just got to make sure that we disentangle our economy from China so we're not dependent on, Chinese whims.
When it comes to the World Trade Organization, are there other kinds of consequences other than just slapping China on the hands if they start to go sideways with some of the stipulations in the World Trade Organization?
Well, we can go to the WTO, file a case, we will win it, and then after we win it, then we can impose penalties on China if they continue their violative behavior. So you think about that procedure, it essentially rewards violators because they can engage in clearly non-compliant behavior for a very long time and get away scot-free. So obviously the WTO is not effective in dealing with China. And we have won every WTO case that we've brought against China since 2006. Wow. And their behavior has just deteriorated. So the WTO is not the answer.
All right, for the sake of the listeners, explain why rare earth minerals are so important. I know a little bit about it, but you could probably articulate it better than I can.
Well, they're essential for lithium batteries. If you have a cell phone, you have some rare earths in your hand. All sorts of things that just show up in, including in our military equipment. A lot of it is dependent on rare earths. So clearly we've got a dependency on them. And so that's why China is threatened to restrict exports of rare earths.
Yeah. I would also say that China is always in things for the long game, and we are always in a panic mode. Is that overstating it?
Well, we're always in a panic mode. That's right. China, I think, actually has a short-term perspective on a lot of stuff. So, for instance, if they really had a long-term perspective, they would just continue to grow, act responsibly until that they became so large that we couldn't do anything to them. But they're acting short term in prematurely taking us on. And so I think that essentially they are the masters of short term thinking, and we sort of miscomprehend that.
Before we kind of get into the Taiwan component, Gordon, we know that China is stealing. And Pompeo, I think, came out a few days ago and actually said that the advances the Chinese military has made in recent years is because of the stolen technology from the United States. And so we kind of went through this many, many years ago, I might add, with Russia. Under the Obama administration, late in his, I think in the last month of the Obama term, he expelled a pile of Russians, and he closed a couple of Russian DACAs. And then several months later, Trump did the same thing. Why are we not punishing China with expelling known intelligence operatives from the United States?
That's a great question, and I don't have an answer.
Shucks. Come on. Make up one.
Well, China's always been treated differently because we've always thought that we could engage China and enmesh it into the global system of rules and norms and treaties and conventions. And so we have always been extremely patient with China, and that has been incorrect policy. And that incorrect policy goes back at least to the end of the Cold War. One could make an argument that we needed China from the 1970s on in order to win the Cold War. That's a really interesting question. Not everyone agrees, but after the end of the Cold War, we did not need to have this China-friendly policy. And in fact, it's been detrimental to us since then. So what we have witnessed in the Trump administration really is a pivot, of moving away from 4 decades of engagement policy towards something more realistic. And that's a good thing. But this is on us, Denise. This is our fault. Or I should say it's the fault of policy. It's the fault of American presidents. And right now, it's good that we have a president who is changing policy. And because of it, he's got support from Democrats for this, who actually, in some ways, are even more resolute than he is. So this is a good story that people are changing their minds, but not everyone has. And we need to work on the other folks as well.
If I was to say there is a very big difference of the China of the Nixon-Kissinger era to the China today, would that be the understatement of the century?
Close to it. I mean, China at the in Nixon-Kissinger period was Maoist. Mao Zedong was still alive. You know, Nixon went to Beijing in 1972. Mao didn't die until September 1976. So then after that, you had Deng Xiaoping, you had economic reform, you had some political reform, or at least institutionalization of rules. And then you have another era, and that is Xi Jinping, the current ruler, who became General Party Secretary of the Communist Party in November 2012. That's an entirely different era where China's going in all the wrong directions. So the optimism that American policy elites had, which I think was misplaced, but nonetheless it was justifiable until Xi Jinping came around and started taking China back to essentially something that Nixon and Kissinger would be familiar with, and that was, of course, Maoism. Xi Jinping's a Maoist in many, many ways. He admires Mao, and his policies are resembling Mao, and he's pushing China in that direction.
I would say CIA really needs to take the lead on all of this, and we're kind of at a handicap here because CIA had an awful lot of Western operatives in China that China somehow found out about, probably through some paid people of their operatives here in the United States, and they killed them. And so Trump Obama pulled out everybody else, and then we were operating in a vacuum. And so whatever we're playing catch up, I think, in a lot of ways in China today, correct?
Well, certainly that's correct. We had a lot of agents killed, and part of it was bad tradecraft on the part of the CIA. There's a number of people walking around this country who have responsibility for what occurred in China. There's a lot of reasons why America's intelligence network in China was rolled up. And one of them is, they penetrated the CIA, but also just our tradecraft was awful. So we've got a lot of work to do. But we don't really at the final analysis, we don't really need to know that much. What we need to know is that this is a communist system. Mao Zedong is alive in Xi Jinping. It's going in all the wrong directions, and we need to disengage. Now, it would be nice to know what members of the Politburo Standing Committee say on any one particular day, but we know that this is a regime that has branded the United States as an enemy. They did that this month. They declared people's war on us. You don't need to know that much more, Denise. So, yeah, of course, it would be good to have CIA agents in China, but you don't really need them if you know what the essential nature of the regime is.
But and then, so a lot of that burden too can be on Treasury. Are we making friends with the countries that are victims of China's debt trapping, such that they're kind of coming along with us on these trade talks?
Well, we are making friends with countries that have suffered from China's debt trap diplomacy, and we're helping other countries to avoid that. I don't know if the countries we're working with really support us on this quote-unquote trade war, because they're not really that involved. There's a number of different ways we are challenging China, and not all of them relate to trade. So you've got Huawei Technologies, which is sort of a trade issue, but it's more a national security issue. Then you have our general help to countries around the world. And we have this and we have that. China presents a multifaceted challenge to the United States and to the international system. And, we have friends on some issues, and we have, and not everyone who's a friend on one issue is a friend on all of them.
It's a very convoluted thing. And so when we look at our poor farmers, I don't think they necessarily realize the thousands of moving parts in all of these discussions, least of which would be Taiwan and the South China Sea, right?
Well, yes. That's another place where China is challenging us. And it's not just Taiwan and the South China Sea. It's across China's periphery, and it's indeed off the coast of Africa. So, for instance, last April of last year, the Chinese used lasers to temporarily blind two of the pilots of a C-130, an Air Force cargo plane. And that is an attempt to kill the crew. And we didn't do anything about it. So, again, this is on us. This is failure of American foreign policy to defend Americans. And, when, God forbid that if ever there is an incident, Americans are going to say, how did that happen? But I know how it happened. It's because we were intentionally oblivious to the risks that China poses to us. We ignored all of these incidents. We allowed them to continue without imposing costs on China for dangerous and destructive behavior, for harming Americans. So, Denise, I think the Chinese are villains. I'm much more concerned about the failure of the American leadership to deal with a known danger.
Well, that's precisely it. It's like we're ignoring. We did this with an awful lot of, militant Islam, I would say,
Absolutely.
for a larger a goal or achievement. In this case, I think it's just trade, but we can't allow, countries, to operate with wild abandon without some kind of consequence. So then we get into a tariff and sanction war.
Well, we have been in one for a long time. It's just that we have been oblivious to what China's been doing. And, people say this is Trump's trade war. That's absolutely 100% not correct. Trump is the first American president to do something about China's trade war against us. And so we should not be blaming the victim here, or we shouldn't be blaming the person who's trying to do something about it. This is not on us. This is something that we have got to do, and we should stop blaming our president. Love him or hate him, this is not his fault.
When it comes to committee hearings, and let's say the Senate Armed Services Committee or the Senate Intelligence Committee, I'm sure that they're getting an awful lot of intelligence that demonstrates that there should be some punishment / consequence to China. Yet I'm not seeing anything really coming out of the Senate and I'm not even going to bother with the House because we don't even know where the House is anymore on these kinds of things. Do we have things in the pipeline that are just kind of being in a suspended state because of these talks?
Well, I don't think that things are suspended. There's a lot of concern on the Hill about China. There have been a few bills that have popped out, a couple on Taiwan, by the way. But, the defense has to be mounted by the executive branch. And Congress can help. Congress can push President Trump, which has been doing, especially on issues like Taiwan. And that's a good thing. But this is, basically this is the president's responsibility because he's the one charged with protecting the national security. And so it's got to be his leadership, and it has been. Now, there have been voices in Congress which are really important. So, for instance, you have Marco Rubio, the Florida Republican, and Chris Van Hollen, the Democrat from Maryland. They together have been working on ZTE, which is another Chinese telecom equipment manufacturer. They've been doing really great work on this, and I hope the president supports them. But there's a lot of good people on the Hill working together on this, because if there's any issue where there's bipartisan consensus, it's forming on China. That's where we really see some very good developments as people on both parties realize that something's got to be done. And by the way, the work on China in changing people's minds, I think you probably have to change more people's minds in the Republican Party than in the Democratic Party.
Fascinating.
This is bipartisan failure in the past, and we need to work on both parties.
What is it between China and Taiwan? I mean, I know that Taiwan, we're still selling them things that's making China angry, military assets. And then Taiwan is even training for fear of an invasion. What is it that China really wants with Taiwan? I mean, we had this one China policy that I think Trump tried to, shoot a couple of holes in, and then he had to back off. What's the history there?
Well, China believes that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic. And the people in Taiwan say, well, we want good relations with you, Beijing, but we're our own separate sovereign state. So this goes back to the Chinese Civil War, which, although people say is over, actually is not. Both Beijing and Taipei claim to be the sole legitimate government of China. But the people in Taiwan would want to have a policy which is, well, we're sovereign, but we're the Republic of Taiwan. Beijing would be really upset if Taiwan said that, and so they don't say that in Taiwan. But clearly the people in Taiwan don't view themselves as Chinese by and large. You look at opinion surveys, self-identification surveys, show that about 2/3 of the people in Taiwan do not view themselves as Chinese. They view themselves as Taiwanese only. There's about maybe 5, 6, at most 10, 12% who view themselves as Chinese only, and the rest view themselves as both. But when you think about that, it means that the people in Taiwan say, yeah, we want, as I mentioned, to have good relations with you, Beijing, but we're not going to surrender our sovereignty to do that.
It's almost like the same thing where Russia, took over Crimea, and we were in this constant battle in Ukraine. I mean, Russia's saying that Ukraine is Russian. So it's kind of the same model, but you can't treat it the same way, right?
Well, the way we should treat both is to tell Moscow and Beijing to use of force is unacceptable, and we will do everything possible to prevent further aggression. It's different in a sense that Russia has annexed Crimea, and we have to unannex that. So we need to employ the strictest sanctions against Russia. And although Trump's policy towards Russia is more resolute than his predecessors, nonetheless, we have a lot more to go and to do. Also, we need to make sure that they back off in eastern Ukraine. With regard to Taiwan, I think there's a very simple fix. We had the President of the United States say in public, the United States will defend Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So any use of force against Taiwan by China will be met with the use of force by the United States against China. We say that, the Chinese aren't going to try. we don't say that, and so the Chinese think that maybe they can take it over. And so we're encouraging the Chinese to adventurism by not being resolute. And by the way, I know this is a little bit long, but both the Korean War and the Gulf War were avoidable. If American diplomats had said we would defend Korea or we would defend Kuwait, history would have been very, very different.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's probably part of the conversation that Japan was just having with Trump on his recent trip to Japan, correct?
I'd imagine so. I mean, obviously they were talking defense matters. Tokyo agreed to buy 105 F-35s. So clearly there was a discussion of defense. The issue about Taiwan, I don't know if it came up in discussions between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump. I hope it did, because if you look at a map, the defense of Taiwan is critical to a defense of Japan. The southernmost inhabited Japanese island is actually south of Taipei. And you can see Taiwan from that island, which is Yonaguni. So Japan's southern approaches are protected by Taiwan. The Japanese know this, and we should know it as well.
And then, of course, you throw into the mix North Korea, and it gets even more complicated.
It's complicated, Denise, but I think that what we have to do is just recognize that Taiwan, that Korea is that China's not helping on Korea. We've had problems with our Korea policy because we have tried to enlist Beijing's support and work with them in order to disarm North Korea, whereas Beijing has actually been arming North Korea. We just need to understand this. We need to impose costs on Beijing for proliferation of some very dangerous technologies and also for handling North Korea's money. And we don't do that. We allow the Chinese, as well as the Russians and the South Koreans, to openly violate sanctions. So this is a failure of American policy.
Where is Europe on this?
Europe really doesn't say very much about North Korea. They've got problems of their own right now.
Yes,
you have, with the most recent elections, obviously Europe is worried about the continuation of the EU, the European project as it's called. So there's a lot of ferment right now in Europe, and obviously they're very concerned. And to the extent that they worry about East Asia, it's about China. It's about business. It's about trade.
Yeah. It's
about Huawei. It's about all these things. So they've got their plate full already.
Same thing with where they are with Tehran, I guess, too. So, I mean, we're truly in a situation where there are so many intersections that have been there for decades. To unwind some of these, it's a Herculean task. I don't know how else to put it, but Mr. Gordon Chang, thank you so much for explaining some of this. I think it's going to be a discussion that's not going to go away for at least a year or so. But well done, and thanks for being on the Denise Simon Experience. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I read a fascinating article yesterday by David French over at National Review. And this particular piece was on Raven 23. And boy, I had to really kind of go back in history to remember some piece parts, but it dealt with Blackwater. And almost everything that has been written about Blackwater has been completely negative. And so what I decided to do was let my fingers do a little bit of typing here. And I'm so pleased that Kristen Slough has decided to join us on the Denise Simon Experience, because she is working diligently trying to get some pardons for those that, oh God, what a case, Kristen. But welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I guess we're never going to get over the let's see, the hate, reputations, and all the things that have been written about Blackwater. That I just put that out there. And at the time, things were. I mean, we have to go back a lot of years, don't we, Kristen? We have to go back 10 or 15 years. Is that right?
Yeah, so the specific incident that my husband was involved in took place in September of 2007.
Mm-hmm. And I think I saw a documentary a couple of years ago that was actually, I thought, to be pretty fair about what happened there. I don't remember who aired the documentary, but the actual team, the Blackwater team, was called Raven 23, correct?
Correct. And there's never been a documentary about the specific incident that happened in September of 2007 in Missouri Square. So there may have been documentaries or information about Blackwater at large.
I think that's what it was, yeah.
Yeah, it could be that people speculated about a segment of it, but we have never once participated in a documentary, although we do have a podcast series that we have participated in that's due to launch this week.
Ah, okay. Well, I can just about imagine that all of you that have connective tissue to Raven 23 have gotten to be quite close since this whole case occurred, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. All the families have stuck together since day one to day now, and we communicate regularly with each other. We make sure we're taking care of each other and just kind of operating in our own gifts. I have the gift of gab, so I do a lot of our media. So does Nick's sister. And then we have others that are great with networking and letter writing and things like that. So we've all just been working together this entire time, like one big family.
Kristen, I was looking actually at the FBI, I guess, summary that was dated October 22nd of 2014. And it speaks to the 4 former Blackwater employees found guilty of charges in fatal Missouri Square shooting in Iraq. It was a 2.5-month trial. Can you, if you would, explain what the sentences were? Because I don't think at the time that this was published, it did not explain who got what sentences. Can you help us with that?
Yes, actually the sentences were, entirely outrageous. So one of the guys, Nick Slatton, he was charged with first-degree murder for someone that they know, the government has known all along, that he did not kill. And then the other 3 guys received 30 years and a day because 30 years was the mandatory minimum sentence that was required because the Department of Justice charged them with federal weapons charges. These federal weapons charges are designed, or I think they came around in the Reagan era, for people who are participating in like gangland crimes and using military grade weapons for them. And so our government charged them with federal weapons charges with 30-year mandatory minimum sentencing for using weapons that they were issued by our government. And they did that because they refused to take a plea deal.
You almost need to repeat that one. I mean, that's about as ludicrous. I guess you'd almost have to look at the contract that Blackwater had with government at the time, correct?
Well, we've looked at all the contractual, things between Blackwater and the government, and it certainly never said we, can't charge you with using the weapons that you were issued by the Department of State. But as a matter of fact, a higher court did come in during our appeal and say that is, like, in a scathing opinion, said that this is cruel and unusual punishment. They said it was draconian that you would charge somebody that you issued a weapon to with a weapons law, or that the underlying crime, that the punishment for that should be, more than sufficient rather than the weapons charges. But the weapons charges were just vindictive. It was a way to try to press us into taking a plea deal, even though they were innocent.
Christian, there's something in my body that tells me we almost had to do this, with the sentencing. I mean, because there were so many cases. I mean, there was a trial and there was a overturn and there was a retrial and all this kind. We almost had to do this at the demand of the Baghdad government, just to kind of placate them.
Yeah, that was actually exactly what happened. So the incident happened in 2007. There was a lot of legal, there was a lot of legal wrangling back and forth. And in 2010, a federal judge entirely dismissed the case. He said that it was absolutely so tainted with misconduct and constitutional rights violations that he didn't even see a way that they could even appeal it and start over. It was so badly damaged, and my question for anybody out there is, if the government had a solid case against these men, if they knew what happened that day, if they believed them to be guilty and they had sufficient evidence of doing so, why would they present a case that was, fully tainted to the extent that a judge completely dismissed it? Another little fact that people should know is that the investigation was actually led by the Iraqi police colonel, who the government has known all along has potential ties to the insurgency. So the FBI didn't show up till 3 weeks later. An Iraqi police investigator collected all of the evidence, interviewed all the witnesses, put out TV commercials looking for victims, collected everybody together, and then our FBI showed up 3 weeks later and take this, and they, put it on their official documents and their 302s, and then it gets presented in front of a civilian court 7 years after the fact. And how it ended up being there from when it was dismissed was, so, like I said, it was completely dismissed. And then Vice President Biden goes over to Iraq, and they're having parliamentary elections, and the In Power group was struggling. And they said, look, honestly, it's a big problem. They think we're weak because those contractors, their case has been dismissed, within the last month, and people are really upset about it. So Vice President Joe Biden goes out onto the news and says, we're going to bring these people to justice. We're going to appeal this decision. A dismissal isn't an acquittal. It's two different things in the American justice system. We're going back after these people. So he went out there and said that due to pressure from the parliamentary elections in Baghdad, not because he believed that these 4 men did anything wrong or because it was about individual accountability or anything like that. It was always about
political,
appeasing the Iraqi government and keeping, trying to make them happy. But honestly, here we are, it's been 12 years. They're still adjudicating Nick's case because it was handled so badly. If they had a real case, why would it take 12 years to litigate? And if they didn't, why would they still be trying it for any other reason than political pressure?
Right to a speedy trial, huh?
Yeah. Here we are a decade later. The appellate court threw out my husband's sentence in January of 2017, and he has still not even been resentenced. So he has literally been in prison more than 2 years without a sentence.
Is there I just don't even, I can imagine you almost don't even know what questions here to ask.
People ask me all the time. They're like, what's going on with it? And I'm like, I have no idea. We don't understand it either. We can't even, begin to put the pieces together and understand how to unravel what's been done here besides the presidential pardon.
So, Kristen, these are really what ended up happening is, I guess, with how I'm reading what Justice Department put out a couple of years ago, is really not a war crime, correct? I mean, this is really more of, involuntary manslaughter kind of thing, right?
So honestly, okay, so first of all, when people think of a war crime, they think of lining civilians up against a wall and, killing them all and things like that. It is definitely not a war crime. So while we're very, very pleased that the president is taking a look at this case along with others, it's a little strange to be lumped in with people who have been accused of war crimes. Yes. Although in looking at a lot of those cases, they have experienced a lot of the same experiences we have as far as unjust trials, judicial irregularities is what they like to call it. By like irregularities, we mean egregious rights violations and things like that. So the war crime thing for sure. As far as the actual men, they, from day one, they're in the moment talk logs, which is a, tactical operations command center. They radio in what's happening. They are radioing in incoming fire. They are radioing in the white Kia approaching the convoy. They're radioing all of this in real time. And I fully believe that all four of these men, their statements have not changed. Their stories have not changed. Nothing has changed in 12 years. And all of these men made decisions in good faith in a combat zone in the surge in Baghdad in September of 2007 when fighting was at its worst. Mm-hmm. So I personally, will not support any narrative that doesn't proclaim complete innocence. But I will say this, that the judge, after going through this entire trial, I mean, it was like 4 months trial, 2 months of, it was like I can't remember now. It was like 8 weeks of deliberations. I mean, it was like incredible. And he goes to the sentencing and he says, it's clear that these are fine young men that just panicked. So even the judge, even after hearing all of the lies from the prosecution and hearing all of the things that they put on over the months and months and months of the case, said that he believed that they were fine young men. So the absolute worst case scenario here is that they misperceived the situation and reacted in an escalated manner. But how could you possibly tell that in the moment? So the worst case scenario here is that these men have been in prison for approaching 5 years at this point. The worst possible thing they could have done here is a case of misperception. But the honest truth is that they are innocent of any criminal activity, and they still are being adjudicated, don't have sentences, and are in prison indefinitely.
I guess I can about imagine the conversations that you're having with, the other people in your circle. But, collateral damage in military conflict happens all the time. And as a matter of fact, I think in 2011, when we decided ultimately we were going to leave Iraq, it was because that the United States could not get from the Baghdad government immunities, which the United States really demands for active military, if sadly, there is collateral death. And in this case, I would think that the United States government would have protected even these contractors for the same reason. Am I way out of base on that one, Kristen?
No, honestly, the policy around this has been kind of a mess, to be truthful. So originally, one of the key features of our appeal is that the United States didn't have any jurisdiction to try the case, and really neither did the Iraqi government. As Department of State contractors, they never fell under what's called MAJA, or the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, which is a huge mouthful, but it specifically states that it is for Department of Defense contractors in other countries. Department of State, it's not the Department of Defense. They may be working towards the same mission, but they are not the same thing. So there was actually a gap in our policy that did not cover Department of State contractors. And the government completely denies that it doesn't cover Department of State, but then go back in and they change their policy to show, make it very clear. But as far as like the jurisdiction goes and the policy goes, that has been a huge issue. We should have never been tried in a civilian court in front of 12 people 7 years later in Washington, D.C., who had never been in a combat situation. That is truly undermines the entire value of a jury of your peers. They aren't a peer group if they've never been in a combat zone, and have probably never held a gun, because Washington, D.C. has the strictest gun laws in the country. So these are people who have probably never fired a weapon, and have never made that life or death situation or, decision, and are trying to pass judgment on people who are trying to perceive things in the moment that will change their lives or end their lives. And another really important point to make out is that I honestly believe that Department of State used contractors for this because they were the perfect scapegoat.
Yeah. I was going to say that.
Department of State, yeah, exactly. And I kind of could tell that was where you were going. So Department of State is the one that sets all of their operating procedures, follow their rules of escalation. They wave off first, they shoot at the engine, you shoot the driver, you shoot the passenger, and then you brake the car if you have to. Like, they enumerate all of those things very specifically. So every action that these, terrible Blackwater contractors took were not a product of Blackwater training them to do it Blackwater's way. It was because they were doing what Department of State prescribed that they did. But because they're a contractor, Department of State can kind of say, oh yeah, that's Blackwater, that's them doing that. And yeah, they're the one taking the actions, but Department of State prescribed down to all of the rules of escalation, the routes they would take, every single thing that they would do, and then, use them as a scapegoat. And one of the things that I also like to point out is because of those really stringent guidelines that Department of State set that Blackwater followed at their direction, Blackwater lost dozens of their guards and never lost a single person being protected. So DOS knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that these contractors were being put into a precarious position, but they did it to keep their own personnel safe, and so that they could, shirk themselves of responsibility once people started to not like it.
Woo, you said a mouthful, but I think we got some kind of indications that validates all that you just explained, of when we started looking deeply at all of the various contracts that we had with diplomat, security personnel, and contractors that state hired out of Benghazi. So
Absolutely.
we have those indications that it's almost as though the contracts were written giving, if anything goes sideways, the State Department plausible deniability.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. They tell you, hey, this is exactly what you're going to go do, but then we're going to leave you and hang you out to dry if something goes wrong. And the problem is for like people at my husband's level or people at Chris's level, they don't see the contracts between state and the company that they're working for. Right. They don't know any of these things. They think that they're, they're going on, like my husband specifically, he worked in Iraq. He went with the National Guard over there. He was deployed for an entire year. He was doing personal security detachments and convoy support, which was basically exactly what he ended up doing with Blackwater. And when he came back home, we really contemplated going back into the Army full time. And what he decided was, the contracts are really long. The deployments are long, the breaks are short and few and far between. So, and he felt that it would be unfair for me because I had finished my degree. And, it's just commonly known that if you're, PCSing or moving all the time, that it's very hard for the spouses to establish successful careers. And I, had worked very hard to receive my degree. So he went to a career fair and he designed for veterans. And he made contact there with some people from Blackwater who were looking for people with his type of experience, convoy support, security details, former law enforcement and things like that. And what they were offering was a 1-year contract. You're gone for 90 days. You're home for 30 days. And because the compensation doesn't, when you're in the military, you get your base pay plus housing, plus medical, plus this, plus that. This is a contractor status. So you receive, a generous cash payment, you're going to be putting your life on the line. And so it made sense for us as opposed to me being forced to make a 4 or 8 year commitment, moving places where we didn't want to go, being deployed for 6 months at a time and only having 2-week breaks. That was what we had experienced. He would be gone, half as long, home twice as much, and we could renew on an annual basis as we saw fit for our life at that time. So it made perfect sense for us for him to go back over, support the mission, keep doing the work that he was doing with more flexibility. And if we wanted to start our family, he could just stop and not be tied to the enlistment for 4 or 8 years.
Okay.
So, I mean, all of our decisions about going into this were done in such good faith. And those stories are the same for Evan, Dustin, and Nick. They all went to do that work because they supported the mission, they supported the government, and wanted the flexibility of, shorter contracts and more time at home.
Kristen, are you familiar with the Ray Davis case?
I'm not. I'm so sorry.
Well, Ray Davis, I'm trying to remember how many years ago this one was. He was yet a contractor. I think he was a contractor with CIA. And he was in Pakistan. I don't know where in Pakistan. It may have been Lahore. And he was part of security. He was apparently some kind of ambushed at a particular intersection. He ended up shooting through the windshield and killed, 2 or 3 people. It was a big, huge deal. They put him in prison. They wouldn't give him a lawyer. State just dragged their feet and give it. The longer story shorter, as I recall, is that the Saudis had to step in at the behest of the State Department because the Pakistanis hated the United States at the time. And they paid some kind of restitution to the families, whatever that necessarily was. And sometime later, he got out and went back to Colorado.
Yeah, honestly, this could have taken a very different turn. So the Iraqi government at the time of this incident in 2007 was negotiating the status of forces agreement with the United States. And one of the things they were asking for was the jurisdiction to try American contractors, not military, but of people who were accused of crimes in their country. Well, I mean, nobody, if you're the United States, your entire contract workforce is going to quit if they believe that they are subject to Sharia law in Iraq. That's not going to work. So obviously, they're like, no, we obviously cannot do that. So when this incident took place, it was actually really close to my husband's R&R. So they sent him home and for his regular R&R. And within that 30-day period of him being home for his, basically vacation, they sent him his ticket back, as they normally would. And then they called him and let him know that they canceled his airline ticket because they had grave concerns that if he flew back into Iraq, the Iraqi government was going to try to arrest him at Baghdad International, and that they were sending the other ones home because they were trying to exert jurisdiction in the case. So, barring the fact that the guys lived in the green zone and were not, by themselves or anything like that, this could have taken a very different turn had they been able to be, apprehended or grabbed by the Iraqi government, who was, it was a setup from day one.
Sure it was.
Our evidence showed that they removed pillowcase-sized bags of shell casings, that people were dumping Iraqi police uniforms over the embankment. Literally the only difference between a civilian and an insurgent is whether they're shooting a gun at you that moment. So the guns were removed, and of course they're going to look and they're going to say, all these people are civilians, because you can't contradict that they're a civilian if they don't have a gun in their hand. So it was. So where we are
with this is that there's some movement here to have the file on President Trump's desk so he can issue a pardon. And of course, you got a handful of people out there that are outraged over this. However, they tend to forget the pardon for Chelsea Manning, and they tend to forget the pardon for Bo Bergdahl, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that these are not generally people who committed a crime and are saying, well, I committed a crime, but I was serving our country and you should be merciful. Most of these cases, if not all, and I just can't say with a blanket statement because I haven't looked into them all, is that they're saying that we were politically prosecuted. Unfair and unjust things happened to me. Exculpatory evidence was suppressed. The chips were stacked against me. We had very competent, high-profile lawyers from D.C. that were assigned to our cases, working with both hands tied behind their backs, and the DOJ pulling every dirty trick they could. We weren't out there working with, overwhelmed and underpaid public defenders. These were individuals at top law firms in Washington, D.C., who could not get the truth out there because of all of the misconduct. Even there were difficulties with the judicial rulings, like not allowing us to enter any kind of evidence relating to building the scene of what was going on in combat. They said basically you can share incidents that happened within 30 days of this one. So we couldn't even build a clear picture for
context.
For the civilian jury of what was going on there. They felt like, these jury members probably felt like these men rolled into DuPont Circle and opened fire on a bunch of people who were going to work that day. And it wasn't anything like that.
You said it was a political prosecution, and it really was, I would say, all things Bo Bergdahl, because we wanted to get rid of, the prisoners in Guantanamo. So we sent back, So, all right. So do I send the listeners over to supportraven23.com? Where do you want me to send these listeners so we can give you some additional support?
Yeah, that's amazing. So we have a couple different domains. They point to the same place. A lot of people have identified us as free, FREE, Raven23. So you can find us on all social media platforms, free Raven23, as well as freeraven23.com. We've had a lot of media appearances. We have a Facebook page. We have Twitter, of course. And then we have a really robust website. Honestly, you could get lost in there for days reading trial transcripts, looking at evidence and exhibits. We've put it all out there. And if you want to buy a T-shirt to support us, or just to donate to the families to help us along while we're, living on one income and doing the things that we're doing, those opportunities are available as well, of course. And we appreciate anybody who's willing to even consider our side of the story at this point, because we've had such a hard time telling it.
Kristen Slough, thank you so much. I'd like to probably revisit this again. And ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being with us for the ride, and we'll see you again very soon.